especially really grateful to our two panelists, Jason and Nithya, for taking time out of their busy schedules to chat with us today and share their expertise and all of their insights with us. For those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Purna Singh. I graduated in 2012 with a degree in business and human computer interaction and a minor in mechanical engineering. I am currently the senior director of product at Meetup. So hopefully all of you guys have some experience with the product since we organize on Meetup. We organize this community on Meetup. I also co-lead the Carnegie Mellon Tech and Entrepreneurship New York City chapter. So this community with Jay and Yujing. For those of you new to this community, and perhaps this might be your first event, I just want to share a little bit of background on TENY and what we do. The TENY chapter has been around for a number of years now. It's happened in a couple different manifestations. Some of you have been probably part of the Meetup community. We decided to reboot earlier this year in order to create just a more vibrant community for Carnegie Mellon alums who work in tech and entrepreneurship to really have a space to come together and get advice, recruit, and just support each other on our journeys. So when we rebooted earlier this year, we really had actually no idea of the kind of like fortuitous timing that we have with COVID going on and organizing these kinds of things virtually. So hopefully you all are on the Slack channel, the Slack community. If not, Jay or Eugene can hopefully drop a link where you can send in your information and we'll send you an invite to join Slack. But we're hosting these kinds of events monthly, and we're bringing together alumni leaders from all different industries to help impart their wisdom and share their learning. We're also in the Slack community doing things like Ask Me Anythings and other different types of programming. If you have any feedback or any suggestions for events or programs, definitely please reach out to myself, to Jay, to Yujing on Slack or email. One of us will drop contact information in the Zoom chat, and you can reach out to us that way. Before we get into tonight's panel, just some housekeeping. If you have questions, which hopefully you do during the course of this Q&A and during the course of the panel, feel free to drop them into the Slack or into the chat. And at the very end, after the panel, we'll have an open sort of Q&A session, and we'll invite people to come up and ask their questions. I'll also ask folks other than Jason and Nithya to turn their video and their mics off so that we can really focus the conversation on the panelists themselves. All right, I think that's all the housekeeping. With that, I'm really excited to kick off tonight's panel. And I'd love to start with intros. So Jason, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Absolutely.
Great. So my name is Jason Hawkins. I graduated from the Tepper School of Business in 2009. I'm based in the New York City area and currently work at Google in a team called the Platforms team. We sell the Google Marketing Platform, which is the demand side platform, Google Analytics, essentially ad tech. In my role as a head of industry, I'm a sales manager with 4 direct reports. I only joined Google at the end of February. So I was in the office for 2 weeks and then I onboarded remotely beyond that. So I'm sure we'll touch on that later. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Nithya?
Hey there. I'm excited to be here. I'm Nithya Chambers. I graduated in 2001 from the Dietrich School. It may have changed names by now, but it was HNSS back then. And I was an anthropology and history major, which, I didn't realize it at the time, but make me a really strong fit for user experience and research. I work at CNN. I lead content experience at CNN Digital and lead content strategy across the emerging products and new business portfolio for the company. My career has really woven through media and digital strategy focused on the social good space. I think adaptation and hiring and people are really at the core of growing and growth for an organization. So really excited to be here and talking about this.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jason and Nadia, again for joining us tonight. For tonight's conversation, we're thinking of structuring this conversation at a high level in two big parts. The first part is really focusing on attracting great talent. So like how to approach it, what are some of the best practices to follow for both hiring managers as well as candidates, and how to actually like have a great interview. And then the second part, we were going to focus on how to actually retain great talent, which candidly really starts at the time that, you know, a candidate signs an offer. So we're hoping this conversation is useful to both hiring managers as well as candidates who are looking to land their next opportunity. So to level set this conversation, I'd like to start with you, Jason. You know, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to accelerate as leaders, how we're going to accelerate like our business growth, right? Like how are we going to get more clients, and how are we going to spend those advertising dollars, and what all of the different like sort of levers are to do that. But I think it's, you know, just another thing to figure out how to actually organize people and teams to make that possible and to achieve all of those goals. So I'd like to ask, how do you think your hiring strategy and your team strategy fits in the context of your overall business strategy, and what's the relationship between those two things?
Sure. So I hire for a few things. First, I look for people that have a growth mindset versus people that have a fixed mindset. People that have growth mindsets are people that, you know, are more who embrace challenges rather than shy away from them. A person who leaps towards opportunities versus makes excuses about failures. Beyond that, I have a coaching and feedback culture. Sales manager, me leading my team doesn't mean that I'm smarter than them, a better salesperson, or anything like that. It just means that I have to do my best to help them navigate their clients, the organization, and unlock their potential. A big part of that is delivering embrace feedback, which is again another function of having a fixed mindset. Won't really thrive on my team or in most organizations just because managers and peers are able to view your blind spots and give you feedback so you can improve. And if you do not believe you need to improve, that is a extreme problem in terms of being in a working group or on a team. There's actually a great book called Thanks for the Feedback, The Art and Science of Receiving Feedback Well. I read it every year before we do performance reviews just because everybody approaches feedback differently, especially when you're receiving it. So I want to make sure I'm being sensitive and thoughtful when engaging with my team, since feedback conversations are probably the most important conversations I have with my team each year. And then lastly, diversity. And when I say diversity, I mean in terms of work experience, working style. So introverts versus extroverts. I do not want a team of Jason clones just because we would not be as effective as a team of people that were different from me. And then diverse in terms of background, just because people's lived experience allows them to bring different aspects of themselves to work, whether it's empathy or things like that.
Yeah, it really sounds like, you know, there's so much that kind of goes into not just thinking about like the individual person, but really like the composition of the team and the kind of culture that you really want to cultivate. And bringing the right person that fits into that culture is a super, super important part of that strategy. Nithya, it's funny, like we were talking last night about kind of this panel and sort of your overall kind of philosophy, and you mentioned how much kind of your education at Carnegie Mellon and like your the study that you did in anthropology has really kind of influenced the way that you think about building like teams and culture. How would you say that like your education's kind of like informed how you approach hiring and building a successful team culture?
Well, I think if you think about the best things and the worst things about your company, they usually all tie back to to the people and the culture, right? Like the greatest things and like the hardest things. So maybe worst was a little bit harsh, but the hardest things all tie back to the people and the culture that you have, that you create, that you enforce, that you adapt to meet the goals and needs of what your company is there to do, right? So to me, I think that notion of culture, and when I talk about culture, I talk about how we work, right? How we work and how we work towards our goals is really what I'm talking about when I talk about culture. And in that, are we a culture of curiosity, or are we a culture of fear?
Mm.
Are we a culture that is looking to transform and adapt and to meet users where they are? And this is kind of, just referencing Jason's growth mindset. Are we a company that is fixed and sort of adapting to, or not adapting, but maintaining, right? And sometimes you have organizations that need to do both, or have parts that need to do both. But how are we creating a whole out of that? And how do people feel connected both to the culture and to their goals, and how are they defined, how are they measured, how are they given feedback, and how are they given opportunities to grow? And I think in that, you always want to be hiring the best people. I think the best advice I ever got was you should always be hiring people that are smarter than you, that have the ambition and vision to take the company and the goals to the next phase, right? And so I think in that, it's also really important to be always thinking about what is the next phase of the company you are trying to become, and what kinds of people do you need to get there. And so I think, to me, that is kind of a guiding philosophy in how we interview and evaluate, because there's the company that we are, and we need to be the best at what we're doing, but there's the company we need to become. And I think that's every company. You're always kind of adapting to the needs of the marketplace, and who are the people that are going to supercharge us to get there. And so that marriage of culture and talent, I think, is very critical, as a foundational piece of of your organization and how it grows.
I think that's such an important call out. And I want to sort of stick to this kind of like line of thinking, because I think, sometimes I think there are outcomes that hiring managers don't end up succeeding in their outcomes, because actually a lot of that work they haven't thought through kind of like how is the organization kind of going to grow. And I think, like, as I'm hiring right now, so this is a plug, if anyone's looking, I am hiring PMs on my team. But as a hiring manager right now, I'm realizing how much preparation actually goes into, like, making sure that I'm hiring the right person. So, like, Nithya, I'm curious, like, how what advice, or what does your process even look like for um like doing that kind of discovery and understanding of your team and the composition, even before you've brought a single candidate into the room?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think, for the amount of time and research, like every time you put time and research into an interview, both as an interviewer and an interviewee, I feel like when you do it and you've done it well, you still kind of wish you had done a little bit more, right? Because there's always something more to absorb, especially when there's a candidate you really want, or there's a job that you really want. And I think as an interviewer, one of the things, especially in a portfolio that's a lot about new business and emerging, ideas and products, there certainly is a bit of a startup mentality that kind of, I think, that gets baked into that, the ability to adapt, to understand sort of what consumers want, and how you take an idea, you mold it to what consumers want in the marketplace, and then how you kind of bring it back to kind of constantly be serving that and working sort of in a space that is fueled by research and data. But I think that, to me, one of the critical things going into that is, again, like, examining where you are and where you want to be as a company, and how that candidate, or that type of candidate, and how that role gets you there, right? And so I think the most important thing you can do for a candidate that could be a part of your company and then part of your culture is really, an examination of the role, how the role will be measured, what success looks like for them, what their first 30, 60, 90 days look like, the focus you're going to be giving them coming in. Because I think sometimes, I've worked in a lot of environments where sometimes you have open headcount and then you're like, oh my God, we have open headcount. We have to fill it right now. Like, otherwise we're going to lose the headcount. But there's really nothing worse to me than like restless creatives or restless people who are geniuses. It can be very
Recipe for trouble.
culture, right? I call it restless unicorns. But I think because we all want unicorns, but you definitely don't want them to be restless. So I think having that structure and focus, especially as people come in, it helps you interview them in a very focused way, but it also lets you bring them on and onboard them in a way that like allows them to connect to the company and the values of the company and understand how the pieces fit together, so that they're part of the growth of the company as well.
Totally. I know, Jason, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just say I would look for folks that add to the culture on my team, because the thing is, organizations are living, breathing things. And if you think about an organization, especially as it begins to mature, innovation becomes less frequent and people, kind of stay in their lanes and they do the job and they're kind of an autopilot. So when you bring someone in, I prefer for it to be someone that's going to shake things up, that's going to question and challenge the way we do things, not in a way that is full of ego, but a way that is curious, and looking to improve the way that we go about approaching our business. Because when you do bring someone into your organization, they are a fresh set of eyes and they can, bring light to, the inefficient processes or the outdated materials or anything like that can actually up level and improve your org. So for me, I look for people that can bring something different, but while also taking into consideration what their onboarding process would look like, especially in a COVID virtual remote onboarding environment. Because based on, let's just say I have a team and it's a small team, if it's 3 people, I need every single person on that team to be well versed. I can't hire someone who lacks certain parts of experience or product knowledge, because that's going to be another thing that makes their onboarding more difficult. Versus if I have a larger team with 10 people, and I've got people of varying levels of seniority, and I've got folks that are more senior sellers that want to become sales leaders, great. Bringing in someone that is more junior, that senior salesperson can mentor, cultivate, and then show their own management and people development skills on them. I have room for a larger organization.
I'm not sure if I might have lost you towards the end, but hopefully.
Yeah, sorry, I think I froze. But I was saying I've got room for that in a larger organization where I have more people with bandwidth, versus if I'm at a scrappy startup and I've only got 3 salespeople and we have aggressive sales goals, we don't have time to ramp anyone. We only have time to crank out deals.
I think that's such an important call out around like the sort of the size of the company really, really matters, and like kind of the speed of execution and the onboarding. I mean, yeah, I just came from 2 years at a scrappy startup, and we just had to hit the ground running. Like there isn't really any time for sort of onboarding, and in some ways you kind of need to index for someone who's already done that job before. And you're like, I need you to come in and do the same exact thing that you've done before in this role again, versus saying, hey, actually this is a growth opportunity for someone who is looking to sort of level up. And they as an organization, we can actually support them in that growth and learning. Because I think that's like also another like horrible thing is like, you bring someone in and you can't even give them the tools and the support that they need. So you're not only just setting up your company for an unsuccessful relationship, but really the relationship that person has to the company too. So I think it's a really important call out. I am curious, Jason, as you were sort of talking, you were talking about, some of the things that, you're looking for in a candidate. What what are some of the markers that you look for in that interview process that really demonstrate that person's ability to execute? Like how do what is the what are there questions that you're asking? Like what does that look like?
Yeah. Yeah. So it actually starts with the resume. It's interesting because since I work for Google, people always want me to refer them or send me their resumes. And a former colleague who I enjoyed working with sent me his resume. But I mean, there were typos, spelling issues, bad punctuation, grammar. And at a place like Google, like that's being filtered out. Like no one's going to see that because it's not going to make it to the recruiter because of those types of errors. So if something does make it to me and it's got typos, I'm just thinking this person didn't even care to update their resume properly. Why would they care about doing this job? I also look for the how in things because I'm on a sales team. I run sales teams, and salespeople, if they're a good salesperson, they at least know how to position themselves in a light that is favorable. But what you'll see on a lot of sales resumes is a person grew revenue by X percent year over year. And I'm looking for the how. Like that's the what. But
Yeah.
okay, you grew revenue, but what does that have to do with you? What role did you play in that initiative? Did you run analytics or reporting to understand that there was a gap in what this client needed? Did you upsell them? Did you sell a net new product? Like these things matter. Did you break a new line of business? If so, how? Like that information in that context is more important to me than you beating goal by 100% because guess what? I don't even know what your goal is. Like that percentage has no context. Was your goal $2 or $2 million? So I'm not worried or concerned with the magnitude of your sales growth. I'm more concerned with your analytical ability and your strategic mindset.
Totally. I think it's such an important call out. Nithya, does that change as you hire for kind of like some more creative roles and whatnot? How does that, does the interview process look a little bit different for you because you're hiring different sets of skills?
I don't think so. I mean, I think to me that like, in a very probably a different way, the how also matters because it's like I think you want to see how people problem solve, right? And how they bring those creative abilities together to solve a new kind of problem, right? And how they think through those solutions. I think to me, one of the things when Jason was talking about, kind of just that sort of resume sort of first glance and that make kind of making sure everything's buttoned up. One of the things I look for is your digital story and how you Google there's a resume, but then you Google someone and how do the pieces of their story, how are they reflected
Totally.
in other places? What is their voice on social media? What is their what, like how are all of the places that represent you digitally also kind of, how do they connect in your resume or not? And have you kind of taken the time to think about the spaces you inhabit digitally that way? Is I think another place, because I think if you like I've noticed sometimes just gaps in some of that. And that doesn't mean like that doesn't mean you have to like sit on Twitter all the time. But like but kind of making sure that there's connectivity and making sure you know what you look like when somebody Googles you to
Right.
kind of make sure that those spaces like look like they speak to each other, especially in when we're looking at spaces that are creative, when you're looking for when you're looking at resumes of folks that position themselves as thought leaders, you're kind of looking for that evidence, right?
Right.
And you're looking for that content that's not being presented to you, but content that is supportive of that from them and from the industry to kind of position them that way.
For sure. I think it's funny. It's like I've been again knee deep in resumes and I'm like constantly Googling, right? Like I'll read the resume that's in Greenhouse and then I'll like immediately go to do a Google search and be like, let me see what the internet says about this person. And like there's so many, I think as a hiring manager, I'm trying to gather, as many signals as I can to understand like, is this person actually like, are they worth bringing them in? And the one thing too, I think, Nithya, that's important to call out, at least for me, has been interesting is like consistency. So like, is what they're saying on their resume like accurately reflected in what I'm also reading about them in different sort of forms, whether they're like, it's Medium articles or it's, something that they've put out. And that's actually another thing that I've like really enjoyed, is getting to know some folks beyond just the resumes or the cover letters, and getting to read like their Medium posts, or getting to read like the way they think, because those are the things that those are, again, a lot more of that signal gathering. I'd love to kind of ask, like, and to make this, like, again, panel a little bit more concrete, like, has there been an example of someone that just like blew you away through an interview? Like, what did they do so well that just impressed you? And what can others kind of take away from that, I guess?
Once, there was a candidate that we were, looking to hire for a content strategy type role. And she essentially, I think, came in with such a I think, like, I don't know how back of the napkin it was, but it felt that way. But it was also extremely detailed sort of analysis of how she would approach the job, right? Like, so it was almost like she led us into her problem solving by kind of opening up with the way she would approach the position, and kind of already doing in real time some of the light analysis where she would start with a role like that. And it was so thorough and so precise, but also so fueled by her own expertise and her own background, that you could see the touches of that. Like, you could see how her background and experience had leaned into it, but you could also, in the example, it started to, you could see how it would start to shape the project. And she set the standard for the types, for the interviews that came after that, right? Like, all the kind of the conversations internally afterwards were just like, I'm blown away, just because she came in so strong and really showed us what she would look like in the role. And I think that was very powerful. It was less, we're on different teams and you're interviewing me and you're an insider and I'm an outsider. It was more, this is what I would look like on your team. And I think it left such a strong impression on a really diverse set of interviewers who all kind of came from different backgrounds. And it was a tough crowd, but I think that really helped everyone see her in the role. And I think she put the research in to kind of deliver that effect.
That's awesome. Jason, anyone that's sort of blown you away? And
yeah, so there was a candidate at a former employer, and I'm a sucker for high emotional intelligence. Like, if someone is extremely high in emotional intelligence, it just always resonates well with me, just because they seem very self-aware. They know what they want. They're focused on the position, the role, and the broader context of what it means for them. Why in their career are they interested in this kind of role? What do they think they can bring to the table? And like Nishia said, really allowing me to imagine them on the team and what that would look like. Another book plug, Emotional Intelligence 2.0 by Travis Bradberry, walks through emotional intelligence. But the people that blow me away are the people who did their research, they're prepared, they're buttoned up. But even more than that, let's say we're in an interview and someone doesn't know the answer to a question. Say you don't know. Say, hey, you know what? I'm so sorry, I don't know. I'll look into it and I'll come back to you, and actually come back. Like, when you send the thank you email, close the loop on that. Because if you don't seem reliable, you don't seem accountable. And there will be times when clients are asking you questions and you don't know the answer. You can't know the answer to everything. Sometimes the clients don't even know the answer. But if you want to be that salesperson that's going to BS and be smooth, you end up looking foolish. And now you could end up making promises or setting yourself up for something that you can't deliver on, and now we lose credibility. So those people who stick to their word, are accountable, and just have like a very clear narrative, like Nietzsche said, on who they are and what they bring to the table. Like, if someone says, and what's your biggest weakness, or you ask that question, like, oh, I work too hard. No, that's not it. If you say, hey, sometimes I've got problems prioritizing because, and you talk about, and you don't make yourself look bad actually, but it's like, wow, you've got to really look at yourself to say that you're bad at prioritizing. But people are bad at prioritizing and still successful. So I just think being able to tell that story and speak clearly to it, it's very impressive.
Totally. I think the other question too, that sometimes like my pet peeve is like, when I open up the conversation for, in a candidate to ask me questions and like, what's your biggest challenge? And I'm like, well, I'm sure you can kind of figure that out right now because you know what Meetup does. You know that we're in this like very challenging period where no one is meeting up right now. So you tell me what you think my challenge is and like how I go about sort of solving it. So that's kind of like my big pet peeve in that sort of area.
Well, it's interesting you talk about questions that candidates ask you, because I would rather someone ask me like my point of view on the industry, but not without offering their own perspective, right? Like I think the end of the interview, when you get to ask the interviewer a question, that's your opportunity to flex. Like that's your opportunity to show off. If there was anything that you planned to highlight that you didn't get through just because of the way the conversation worked, then this is your chance to flex your muscles, show how smart you are, show how thoughtful you are, and close the loop on anything. Let's say there was a certain question that didn't, like your response didn't land right, and you feel like there might be some gray area. Circle back to that and alleviate the interviewer's concerns. Like I think that's an awesome thing, as opposed to what's your biggest challenge? Because my biggest challenge when I joined the company X amount of time ago has nothing to do with you. And if you don't get the job, that definitely has nothing to do with you. So ask something that allows you to really set yourself apart and differentiate versus the other candidates.
Totally. I think one thing that's also taken me a lot of courage to ask in when I was interviewing for different roles was like at the end being like, is there anything during the course of the interview that gave you pause? Or, and actually invite the opportunity for the hiring manager to tell me what their concerns are so that I actually have that chance to address them. And I think like it's really scary, I think, in the moment to figure out like, or to ask that question and invite that uncertainty into the room. But I think the point that Jason, you've been trying to make, I think is like very key, which is like, how self-reflective are you, right? Can that growth mindset, can you even take, that feedback back in that moment and be able to address it in a way that's constructive and shows the interviewer that you are thinking a lot more about, your growth.
It's exactly what you said. Like that's a coaching moment. The candidate is asking for feedback. And I think that alone is powerful because, like I said before, someone does not want feedback or cannot embrace feedback and then figure out the right way to activate or incorporate that into their way of working, then they won't be successful in any role.
Yeah. Nithya, you had also said something last night that kind of Jason just touched on, but I kind of want to tease out too, which is that honestly, I mean, the interview, the hiring manager has their own agenda, they have their own questions, but really it's up to the candidate to drive that narrative and to like really like own that. And maybe that might not take place during the majority of the interview, but towards the end, really that's kind of like, a candidate's place to address those things. Like, what advice would you give to a candidate in terms of like, setting that narrative, setting the stories, like how should they approach it?
Well, I think it to me, it kind of goes back a little bit to the preparation, right? And it's what are the 3 points you want to make, or what are and even sometimes, there's setting it up that way. If like literally, if I could leave you with 3 points of things to remember about me, it's this, right? Like find your voice and your way of doing it. And I think like some of that too, I think in finding your voice in like that pitch is also practicing, right? I think practicing your intro, practicing in front of a mirror or whatever, like how to deliver that in a way that feels conversational and feels like in the moment, but using that moment and other moments where it's about you're asked to kind of to drive it explicitly, to reinforce those points and to make sure that you are you're able to land the things you want the interviewer to know about you and why you're right for the position. And I think because I think there are always things it's, and another way to think about it is, if I left this interview and there were things I didn't say, what would I be most upset that I didn't get to say? And how to
Totally.
make sure you're kind of weaving those stories and those examples in, almost no matter what questions come at you, the things about you that you want to highlight, right? So kind of figuring out a way to make sure that that is driving the conversation about you and why you're right for the position.
For sure. One last question on sort of like the hiring and onboarding piece, or the hiring piece, before we go into talking about onboarding and what happens when someone does sign the offer. I'm curious, like, how has COVID affected your hiring process? And Jason, maybe we can start with you, because I know like you're hiring for salespeople, and there's so much about like how someone presents themselves when they're in a room and whatnot. And now we're kind of just like all looking at a screen all day long. Like, how are you trying to sort of suss some of these things out that you normally would have taken advantage of, being in the same room with someone?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll say that the same rules apply. The context is just different. So if I were interviewing candidates in real life in person, and let's just say it's the sales pitch round of the interview, or it's just a normal interview, does the person have presence in the room? Can they read the room for certain cues? For example, my clients are advertising agencies. Sometimes you'll be in a room with 30 different people, and you'll see certain people looking at their phone maybe, or on their laptop, or distracted. So what do you do to engage them? What do you do to draw them in? Converting that over to what that looks like in this digital world. What's their eye contact like with the screen? Are they holding my attention? Can they tell if I'm drifting? Can they see, maybe this answer is too long, or maybe I'm going in the wrong direction? So do they pivot or do they check in with me to say, did I answer that correctly? Or, like, what are they doing to engage and show that they know how to, read a room and demand attention, especially maybe it's even harder right now. If I'm on my laptop right now having this call, I could be in email, I could be texting.
You could be 1,000 other things, yeah.
Someone could just turn their camera off and go make a sandwich, So what are you doing, as a candidate to make sure you are, holding the attention of the audience, but also focus and organize? Are you speaking clearly? These microphones aren't the best. Are you speaking too quickly? What's your tonage like? So all of those cues still matter. The context is different, and it's tricky because folks aren't used to presenting over camera or on, Zoom as frequently as we are today. But I think that also, again, shows growth mindset. There's a challenge here. We are
roll with the punches
in the virtual world. What are you going to do to adjust?
Yeah, totally. Okay, cool. Well, I'd love to transition a little bit this conversation into talking a little bit after, what happens after a candidate has signed their offer. You've all agreed to like do this thing together. What do you guys think like makes for a really successful onboarding experience for new hires?
I think Jason was you
Sure.
said yesterday that you had some like very recent kind of onboarding experience.
So I just now brought a woman onto my team 2 months ago, and it's interesting, right? Because at Google, it feels like 95% of roles go to internal candidates, and I really, really, really want external candidates. It's even more interesting though in this digital world, or I'm sorry, work from home situation where someone's onboarding fully remotely, just because they don't have context for the office. It is difficult to meet people. What I do, I actually have a full what do you call it? A Google Sheets document for onboarding, for the different platforms I have a login for, the different trainings to take, the different people to meet, how we do one-on-ones, et cetera. But I also set someone up with a new hire buddy, because I actually have structure for my team, but it's pretty loose. I don't tell you how to do your job. I let you know what my expectations are from an outcome standpoint. And when someone is onboarding, I think it is so important to ask 1 million questions. Like even at CMU, I was asking questions all the time. Like in calculus, if something wasn't adding up, question, just because, I'm trying to get these A's and I can't get an A if I'm fronting like I understand what the content is. The same thing applies when you are a new hire at a company because no one expects you to know the answers. So I think you should be asking as many questions as possible, meeting with different people, getting their perspectives because there's no rule book on how to do your job. I joined Google in February. All of my peers do their job extremely differently. So I couldn't just take someone's roadmap and apply it to myself because their business is different from my business. Their team's different from my team. So how do I take all these different nuggets that I get from different people and then craft my own style out of that? So I think ask questions as much as you can because that window gets shorter and shorter every day where you can be a new hire and you have room to say, hey, this may be a stupid question, but because you can't do that 2 years in. Because then people say, what have you been doing for the past 2 years? Like, what is this? So don't play yourself. Ask questions early because then you can build your knowledge, figure out what you know and what you don't know. And then when you're in your one-on-one with your manager or with your new hire buddy that you're paired with, that's a peer, you say, hey, I've got these questions. Take notes, write down everything. If you're on a call and you're hearing acronyms that don't make sense, just take note of it. And then when you meet with your manager or your one-on-one, say, hey, I have these things on the agenda because I need some help. I think that's a great way to ramp. Just be organized and very, very serious about accelerating your learning. One other thing, and I promise you, it is my last book recommendation. There's a book called The First 90 Days. It's by Michael Watkins, I think, and it walks you through the critical things that you should do in your first 90 days in a new role or at a new company to increase your chances of being successful. So I think that's also something extracurricular for you to be doing in your free time to make sure you're at least tracking against where you should be. And I'd also say read a lot, like read the emails, read the newsletters, because this stuff isn't second nature to you. So as things come out over email, read it, take the trainings, study the products and do what you can because you're not going to come out the gate with strong client relationships as a salesperson. But if you have strong product knowledge, at least you can use that to establish trust and credibility with clients early on. To get things done. Lastly, make friends. People like working with people that they like. So if you are new, make friends with people so it's not as annoying for you to bug them and ask for help or put time on their calendar to walk through things.
Totally.
I think against the backdrop of like a global pandemic, I think for hiring managers, I think it's this, if there was ever a moment to kind of lean into like empathy and EQ in the workplace, this is it. And I think, Jason and Prerna, we both talked a lot about the whole, just, you don't have the experiential touch of going into the office and knowing the culture and knowing how it's organized and people's personalities in person. And so I think, sometimes what, there had with in onboarding, it's like, I'm going to draw out for you what our company looks like, right? I'm going to draw out for you the way the teams work. I think sometimes helping people, and I've done that even when we were in the office, but I think given that this is sort of the foreseeable future, going that extra mile to show them how things connect, especially when so many conversations have become less hallway conversations and more very focused one-on-one or group meetings, that when you're new, you don't know what you don't know what you don't know. So you don't know what you're not getting added to. Right. And so I think sort of being in their shoes to guide them, even if things feel a little bit, if it feels like it might be overtouch, I think that's probably not possible in COVID, especially as you're trying to welcome someone in and make them feel part of the team.
I think about all those like water cooler moments, right? Like where you might have like run into someone at, in the kitchen or grabbing coffee or even like waiting for an elevator, like simple things that we've clearly taken for granted this entire time. And like those micro interactions that are happening that help you build relationships, like, there's definitely sort of like a perceived loss, especially sort of starting in a new role. I think Jason kind of talked about, the sort of two pieces of advice that I would sort of give to someone starting to is like, I think the asking questions thing is absolutely brilliant. Not just for your own clarity, but like I've also found that like when you ask those questions, like there have been times where people are like, actually, that's a great question. Why do we do that? And it's like you realize that like for a very long time, people like don't even challenge assumptions. And so you can also think of it, right? Like sometimes I feel guilt for asking all these questions and like, I'm sorry you have to like, explain this for the umpteenth time, but it also forces folks that have been in their roles for a long time to go back and reevaluate like, oh yeah, why are we doing that? Why is it this way? And it opens up a whole sort of set of conversations where it's like, actually, this is like organizational debt that we've had to pay, we haven't paid off, or it's tech debt that we haven't paid off, or so it usually prompts a conversation. And then the other sort of thing that has really worked for me, I think, as I've been onboarding in my new role too, is I'm definitely sort of setting up virtual coffee meetings with folks. But at the end of each meeting, I'm asking that person, "Hey, who are two other people that you think I should really meet? That would be really helpful in further clarifying some of the things that we talked about." And like that's been a really nice way to kind of like work my way virtually through an organization. It also works in person too. So then like, you have kind of a list of people to kind of ask and get perspectives on. But I found that to be really effective this time around. And just like sort of hit up people on Slack and say, hey, like, I just talked to so-and-so and they recommended I talk to you. Are you down? And it's been a really nice way to sort of like break the ice. I think the other thing about sort of having a really successful onboarding experience is sort of sharing your expectations with your new hires as well. Like Nithya, have you figured like how do you share that? Is that like a document, or is that something that you're just kind of communicating? How do you think about sort of sharing your expectations with your new hire?
Well, I think one of the things I think is really critical is like, I don't think you can I can't, overly state how critical I think the exercise of writing things down is, and not in like a phone notes kind of way, but I mean like in a narrative way, because I think so much, especially this is also true when you're inside a company and you're moving roles, or you're inside a company and like redefining some aspect of what you do. I think when you write things down in like a a thoughtful lengthy, not doesn't have to be pages, but like a page or two, it gives everyone an opportunity to react to something, right? And like it creates a space for collaboration, which I think is even more critical in this time. And it's actually something I've started doing more frequently in the last couple of years that I wish I had been doing more consistently throughout, because I think there's a lot of, it feels sort of like, oh, we had a conversation and we're good.
Right.
But I think and then I think sometimes, sometimes you interpret documentation as proof. And I don't think that's what it is either. I think it is a deeper understanding of like the task at hand. I think it gives you a minute to really think through what you're asking of someone, or what's being asked of you, to react to it, to offer suggestions or changes, or to get clarifications. And so I think that that documentation, and I think really giving new hires a focus in the first 30, 60, 90 days allows them to get to know the organization and the culture of your organization in a way that is tied to the work.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise it's end up sometimes can have conversations that are like, oh, I've heard you're great, but I don't completely know how to work with you yet, right? So even a project that doesn't seem like it's like even a project that isn't maybe necessarily like going to change the trajectory of the company in the next 90 days,
Yeah.
like allows people to get to know each other with context,
Yeah.
and add value and understand how the pieces fit together. So I think that's really, that definition is really critical and kind of helps set up the right path for someone to become part of the company.
You said something too that I think is is really fascinating, and something that I'm actually starting to do too with my direct reports, which is like, it's not just about like aligning on the work, but like also aligning on how we're working together. Like, what is the contract that like me as a hiring manager, how am I establishing that with my direct reports? And it's like one of the things that I started doing in this role is like I wrote down like an operating guide to how I work, and like what are things that like what are things like how do I like what are things that like tick me off, like what can I not stand, and what are some areas that I'm personally working on and trying to improve on, or where I want feedback from my direct reports. And I think like it goes both ways, right? Like sharing expectations both from a hiring manager perspective on what I expect from my direct reports, but then making sure that they have clarity that what they can expect from me as well, as their manager. I think, as we kind of like beyond just onboarding and thinking about the 30, 60, 90, and the 1 year and the 2 years, I'm curious, Jason, because you kind of talked about owning your own role and looking to others to kind of get an understanding, but really defining it on your own. How do you balance like sort of giving someone the autonomy to explore the boundaries of their role versus executing like your vision, for what you think the role should be?
It's a good question. So vision's interesting, right? Because companies have visions, organizations have visions, and then individual teams have a vision that's somewhat aligned. They all cascade down. I would say that for me, from an expectation standpoint, we have pretty clear OKRs, and that means objectives and key results. So, like, what's expected of you from a deliverable standpoint, but the way that you get there, it's kind of a choose your own adventure. Like Nitya said, I mean, I do the mapping of this is what this team does, this is what that team does. Like, this is how everything is connected just to help folks navigate. But I mean, there's more now that I'm going to say it, it sounds weird. There's more than one way to skin a cat, even though, like, why would you skin a cat? But there's more than one way to get the job done and to be successful in the role. So I'm actually pretty interested in seeing people's curiosity and see how things go. Now, mind you, if we're seeing a major diversion from the way the job should be done, if performance is looking shaky, then that's when I come in and do some light coaching to help get the teammate back on the right track. Because I do want people to be autonomous. I do want them to feel excitement about the work. I never want someone to feel like they're doing something because their boss wants them to do it. Because then that kind of stunts their creativity and just passion for the work. So that's my take. But I mean, if we get into a situation where like performance is not good and the person isn't self-aware enough to see, I keep doing the same thing the same way and things are not improving, then that's when I would step in and offer some guidance and coaching.
Got it. Cool. We are going to open it up to questions and answers in just a moment. So if you have a question, please definitely enter it into the chat, and we'll start going through them. But before we do, I have sort of one or a couple last questions. So I'd love to, I think the process of like hiring and onboarding and getting the right people, I think, is an iterative process, and we are constantly learning from, the sometimes the mistakes that we make, or the successes that we have. So do either of you have like a story of like, the first person you hired or the last person you hired, and like how did you know they like worked out or didn't work out?
Well, I think, the one of the last people that my company hired who came from my network, it actually relates to the question you asked before about the giving autonomy to explore boundaries, versus executing your vision for the role. Because I think on paper, the role seemed a certain way. She came in with like a vision for how it was going to be executed that was so much more, I think, comprehensive and nuanced than we could have imagined, right? Because it was a new area. So you're kind of, when it's a new area, you're kind of adapting an old role to a new area. And I think like she came with the expertise of the new area, and really turned the role into something that became like a model for how the company would shape that role in the future. And so to me, that is about sort of, to me, everything goes back to culture for me, right? And I'll do my book recommendation here, which is What You Do Is Who You Are by Ben Horowitz. I think like how to evolve for the culture that you want. I think in that also recognizing the players that you have, and how you're modeling that culture, and how you're creating sort of opportunities for people to come in, like Jason, what we were talking about at the beginning. Jason mentioned sort of people that are able to come in and shape the culture, right? So I think to me that underpinning and that foundation of sort of the culture that you want for your company, and how it allows people to grow, is what ultimately gives them the space to take roles and level them up, and to bring dimensions to them that you didn't understand before. Because I think more and more we're seeing candidates that are multidisciplinary, which is what you want.
Yeah.
So I think when you want multidisciplinary candidates and hires, and employees, you have to give them space to expand a little bit and to own roles in different ways based on their expertise.
Totally. Any advice that you'd give your younger hiring manager self, now that you've kind of gone through the motions of hiring?
To me, it's all about focus, right? I think people really, especially when you're doing something new, I think when you're doing something new, when you're starting something new, you need a little bit of focus and structure at the beginning. And I think you need it throughout, but I think like it changes throughout. And I think the best thing you can do is sort of have clarity around what the role is for someone coming in. You should ask for that clarity if you don't have it, and create sort of, whether you're asking for those things or as a hiring manager, you should be giving them sort of what some of those tasks are to create the bond between the new hire and the culture. And I wish I had advocated for that more for myself. And I wish I had been more consistent about giving that to folks along the way.
That's awesome. Jason, any advice you give to your former hiring or your younger hiring manager self?
Yeah, I made one bad hire once, and it was a recommendation from a friend, and the person's like, listen, this person grew the business when I was at my startup very aggressively. It seems to be at the same stage of the startup that you're at. This person is very hungry, etc. And my friend, even though I never worked with him directly, he did have a very, very good trajectory at his company, but I didn't take his company's culture into account. And I found out about that company's culture afterward. And the company's culture was very boys clubby, like not necessarily looking at the fundamentals of scale sales and how you can be strategic, but more like whining and dining clients to get deals done, and just like everything that's the opposite of my sales style. And even though in the interview process, there was a panel, it was me, my manager, who was the head of sales, cross-functional partners, and everyone was in agreement. But there was one red flag for me around strategic ability, but I kind of chalked it up to this person's probably very nervous. I'm a very tough interviewer. So everyone else signed off. I think this is great. Now, like, I am way more focused on, like, if something's not sitting right, really drilling into it and getting to an outcome that I'm satisfied with. Either the person's not a fit, or okay, this is the person's style and what would work. Just because making a bad hire like sets you back so much in terms of building your team, because now there's this disruption too with the team culture and dynamic, and it's something you gotta sit with. And it really does. I mean, I would say it sets you back a year, because it's the time that you took recruiting that person, onboarding that person, ramping them, and then for me, I do believe that people have the ability to grow, develop, and change. So there's the time that you spend to coach and wait and see and test and do all these things, which is now
all the
taking
other
me away
people's
from,
time. Yeah.
and it's taking me away from doing my job, which is managing the team, or giving attention to the people that are excelling and that need me more than, taking all of your energy and putting it towards the person that's lagging. So I would just say hiring decisions are very, 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 very important, which I'm sure every manager here knows.
Awesome. That is very solid advice. Let's do this. I think there are a couple questions that have come through. So why don't we go ahead and take them, and actually if folks are comfortable with it, like why don't you all come up and ask the question. So I'm trying to see, John, are you around? Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So my question is basically like I've been a big believer in the buddy system for onboarding for a while. It's something I've used a lot. But I'm just curious to get other people's perspectives around incentives. So, one of the things that I've seen go well is that, if a person is just very much a believer of like, I want to just, culturally, like I want to just help the team succeed, they'll invest the time in helping the new person come up to speed. But, some people will see it more as a trade-off against their OKRs, right? Like I'm going to invest my time into this person versus at the expense of my own performance indicators, right? So I'm just kind of curious how folks have thought through the incentive structure for like the buddy system to just make it so that everyone's incentives are aligned when you're using that, because I personally have thought it's the most successful thing I've found.
I would say the answer is being explicit about expectations and letting them know this is a 20% project or something where it's like anything else. For example, at previous employers, I've been one of the co-leader of the Black Employee Resource Group. But even though there's a lot of work that comes through running the Black Employee Resource Group, I can't let my actual work deteriorate or decline because of that. So I think it's being very clear on expectations. Like, hey, this is something that, first of all, the person that I map them with is someone that says, hey, I'm interested in being a leader someday. I want to manage a team and I want the opportunity to cultivate talent. So I'll say, okay, great. If an opportunity comes up to be a new hire buddy or something like that, I'll do my best to get you matched. But you have to make the person know like that they actually have to work for that. Like just because they raise their hand doesn't mean they get the opportunity, because there are a lot of people that want the opportunity to cultivate talent. So now that you have gotten this opportunity, number one, make the most of it. Like don't miss one-on-ones with that person. Don't act like it's a bother for them to come to you for help. But then beyond that, when it comes to your actual OKRs, make it very clear that you're still expected to deliver at the same level as you would without this responsibility. And also, if the person does see decline, how much time are you really spending as a new hire buddy? Because you don't have to join all of their calls all week. Then say, hey, you'll join one call per week with them, with a client, or you'll say, hey, I'll set aside 30 minutes a week for your first 3 weeks to help you with your pitch. Like help prioritize and set boundaries around the engagement, which is also a sign of leadership in managing.
Yeah, let me just ask, that's all very helpful. And like, but just a click more like, tangible, right? Have you ever given someone a higher bonus because they did a really good job onboarding someone?
No.
Have you ever felt, and you've never felt the need to have to do that, right? Because it's selection bias of finding the people who are intrinsically motivated to want to cultivate talents and develop that skill set is sort of incentive enough.
Well, yeah, I feel like the incentive is now you have this experience and other leaders in the organization, as well as I, have seen you cultivate talent. Now you are in the consideration set more so than if you hadn't had this experience. I think it's equivalent to someone saying, let's just say it's a salesperson who's on a commission plan and they're like, well, I've been beating my sales goal, I deserve a raise. And it's like, well, yeah, when you come at 120% of your sales goal, you get paid out at 120% of your sales incentive, versus if you come in at 80%, you're paid out at 80%. So you're being compensated for exceeding your revenue targets. I think of it the same way.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. I'm curious to just get others' perspectives on how they thought about that through time. So that's super helpful. Thank you so much.
Nydia, what do you think?
Well, I was saying, like, I think one of the things we've talked about is, as we kind of take on, our company is kind of brought OKRs in to the work that we do, right? So we kind of started working that way a few years ago. And because, our legacy organization is television. And so the digital portion of the company started to work that way. And I think for us, a lot of that, there's a lot of mentality that needs to be driven and shifted by the culture, right? And so we don't necessarily have, like, John, just to answer your question head on, that the notion of adding of like a bonus structure or something for new hires and onboarding, but really thinking about the parts of our culture and how those become part of our OKRs, right? Like, and how we think about that, because if we believe that the culture is part of a foundation that is going to drive all future success, how we invest in that and how we ask our employees to invest in it and to invest in each other is just a critical part of how we do everything else. And so, I think for some of that is like, how close does that need to become to incentivize your employees to care about some of those connection points, knowing that, how they fit together is going to drive the way you work, which is going to drive your outputs, right? So I think thinking about that incentive structure in that tactical way is really important. And sometimes it requires having uncomfortable conversation as an organization. And I also think it's when you understand how your employees are motivated, kind of matching the way that they're motivated to how you get them to engage in the culture is really critical.
Great question. Jay, I think
sorry, and I realized I was on mute, but thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean. Jay, you had a couple of questions for the group.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask all of them, but as questions have been coming up, I've just sort of been dropping them in the chat. The most recent one, we were talking about developing a talent pipeline. And I know, Jason, you mentioned that, you're part of organizations within a large company that allow you to cultivate pipeline for potentially internal hires or transfers. I'm interested in how you guys think about developing your talent pipeline externally and potentially building relationships with folks that, you might want to bring in at some point, even if there isn't a role. And how has that development changed in a post-COVID work from home world?
Sure. I'll say, so at every company at which I've worked, I add all my colleagues on LinkedIn. I add my clients on LinkedIn. So as you do that, you're building a network of folks that are in your industry that know, the way to navigate. And when I do have an sales, a job, a headcount that's open, I post it to LinkedIn. And either a person I've worked with before or a person that I have worked with that is friends with people in our industry, they usually refer them to me for the role. So I think that's a great way to cultivate a network. I also, when you're in with being in the Black Employee Resource Group and leading that, I was at Afrotech, I was at AdColor, so I'm meeting other people of color in the industry at these events. I also, when you're at CES or whatever conference that other media people are at, you meet them then. I'll tell you that prior to Google, I worked at a company called Nextdoor. The chief revenue officer at Nextdoor was the VP of sales at AppNexus when I worked at AppNexus. She's the one that brought me to Nextdoor. At Google right now, the woman that brought me into Google is the person I worked for at AOL. So I say that in my career was Goldman Sachs, AppNexus, AOL, Nextdoor, and now Google. So I say that to say, for the past two companies I've been at, I was brought by someone who I had worked with before. So I think that cultivation of talent pipeline is a very real thing.
I would add to that too. Oh, go ahead, Nithya.
No, go ahead, Prerna. I'll go after you.
No, I was just gonna say, I think like it's such an important distinction to make, and one sort of advice I've gotten recently as I've been hiring is like, you're not just hiring when there is a headcount open. You're just always hiring as a hiring manager. And that's just sort of the mindset that you need to keep, that whenever you do meet someone, it's always kind of in my back of my mind. I'm always kind of just like logging them and being like, okay, I'm going to remember this person because they said something, or, I really appreciate their perspective. And I found that like, I think especially, and this is also true of my own career, is like the last, basically every job that I've gotten after my first job that I got when I was at Carnegie Mellon has been through like a warm referral or a warm connection, because I knew that person from my first manager. Out of my first job at IBM was from Carnegie Mellon, and then subsequently got hired because someone knew what I did and hired me in my other role. So I guess the point that I'm just trying to make is that very much kind of, about maintaining sort of relationships. And I think conversely, if you are looking for a role, it's always worth kind of looking through and seeing, who do you want to go work for too? It's not just about, they might have a headcount open, but they might not, but it's always like worth sort of proactively reaching out to those that you admire and leaders that you admire, and kind of doing that proactive outreach and saying, hey, really love what you're doing. Not looking for a job right now, but wanted to sort of like, make that introduction. What are you going to say, Nithya?
No, I was going to say, I think when you're in leadership, and when you're a leader in your company, I think hiring is what you're doing. Like, developing your talent pipeline is your second secret job. And it's everybody's responsibility, and the pipeline is always there. And I think, just as you said, when there are great people and you encounter them, like, you should always be thinking of them and thinking about like where you might work with them next. And that might be months from now, it might be years from now. I think like one of the things that we have really leaned into in the last few years is kind of talent-led hiring. Mm-hmm. Because I think, especially as candidates become multidisciplinary, you're never like, you don't know who you're missing when you just post a job description, or you wait for the approval of that, and some of the people that you want aren't looking for a job, right? You are wooing them. So I think that, and so to the year Jason referenced earlier, for a new hire, like, you can add like 6 to 12 months to that if you're going after somebody that's not actually looking for a job. They're just awesome and you want them at your company. So I think that cultivation is really critical. And I think that, to answer one of the things Jay's posed, I think one of the advantages of COVID is, I think it has opened up where people can be. Like, so one of the advantages of working remotely, let me not say the advantages of COVID, like one of the advantages of working remotely like this is that I think it's easier to connect to folks in a lot of different places, and to bring them on as, like, especially in environments where companies are comfortable and open to remote working. So I think it really loosens the boundaries of geography, in terms of connecting and finding talent and building that pipeline. Especially because I also think people are in a moment where they are thinking about what they want to do. And so there's, I think, a bit of an openness sometimes to having some of these conversations.
Awesome. Mickey, you have a couple questions. Would you like to come up and ask them?
Just two real quick. I was just wondering, I worked for Pricewaterhouse and IBM for a long time, and I've been remote for like 25 years. So I'm just used to it. But COVID puts a different, like, periodically you would have people gather together. And I'm just curious on, how do you manage team dynamics in this very stilted remote world?
So that's a very good question. I do a few different things. One is I have 2 coffee breaks on my team's calendar. They're totally optional. One is at 10:30 a.m. on Mondays, and the other one is at 10:30 a.m. on Fridays, and it's just time for my direct reports to just come on, kick it in the same way that in the office we would have the micro kitchen, which is where like you go there, you make a coffee, you see someone, you chat for a bit. Since we don't have that, I added these to calendars just so my team can have time to connect and not talk about work and just relax, especially since as a manager, I don't want my only engagements with them to be my team meetings, my one-on-ones, because when you do that, especially since we are all virtual,
Yeah.
you miss the human aspect and the connecting. So it's like, oh, and my daughter had a recital, and oh, I, made my first, I don't know, banana bread or the bread that everybody was making. Yeah, like people are just talking about things in their life, and it's not all work, and it just makes you feel better about being alone. Because the thing about the current environment is I've got direct reports that either have 2 children and it's like madness, and they have a nanny or they don't have a nanny, or you have people that are single and they're just in their apartments and they don't really get much engagement with folks. So how do we help from a wellness standpoint, lift people up and make them feel better about the situation we're all in?
Got it. I just think it's challenging because, again, those periodic meetups, you'd be in the city and you go hang out and get drinks, and that interaction just naturally happens. Nydia, how do you foster that kind of community in this kind of environment?
Well, I think it is a great question. It's really important. I think honestly, sometimes if like I'm going to be a little bit cheesy, but like as someone says, like a manager, you gotta hold like the cheesy sort of aspect of it and plan it a little bit, right? Like
you start the karaoke.
I've seen different things. I've seen like people that like bring a bartender in to teach everyone how to make a drink at home. I've seen like different games and like I've seen like icebreakers. And I think it's it always feels like when you have to lead it, and I hate leading. As someone who's hosted 5 baby showers over Zoom, I hate icebreakers on video conference. But I think that every time I've done it, I've been so surprised afterwards how many people ping me and say like, thanks for organizing that. We really needed it. Like, and I think there's I tend to default, like everyone's sitting on video conference all day. You don't want to like add another video conference, but I think there's like a kind of sometimes just a desire with people, especially, we all have teams where there are people that have joined that have never met the team in person. I think that like those moments for people to get to know each other and to be social are welcomed, even if you have to program it a little bit, so that it feels, so that you can create connections for people that may not find them. But I think, it requires more than like, let's go meet up and get a drink. But every time I do it, I'm like, oh my gosh, we should be doing this more, because I think people are so hungry for that connection with people that they're working with all the time. I think the other part of it, team dynamics, is like, I think that there's probably a culling of meetings that we have that were just standing meetings that are not, the time isn't as organized. So I think it's almost like, can we thin down some of like those meetings to help improve team dynamics so people don't feel irritated that they're sitting in video conference with each other without an agenda? And can we add more things that feel a little bit more community oriented and social, so that there's that balance with coworkers?
Got it. This is kind of related to that. This is my last question, and it's how to retain people. And I think building the community would help.
Mickey, I think you're breaking up a little.
To you now that say that, I have a feeling that certain people may.
I think we lost you, Mickey. I'm not sure if you can hear us, but if you want to type your question out, that would be a little bit better. I think I think her last question was around retention. I think that's what was in the chat.
Yeah, I think she might have lost connectivity.
Well, if the question was about retention, I'll just add that I think that one of the things that's really important both in COVID and pre-COVID is, and post, is people want to know how they fit in and if they're going to be growing with the company, and if the company is kind of fulfilling the things that they want for their career and for their lives, and for that growth. And I think, one of the things that I think is really important about retention is making sure that people see that connection point when the organization sees it and you see it as their manager. But I also think, not everyone stays forever. And I think having honest conversations with folks about what they want, and whether or not they're going to be able to get what they want from the company based on what the company needs, is really important and honest. And I think that some of those things are journeys too, because like the same way you don't want restless unicorns, you want everyone on the team like rowing in the same direction. So I think like being able to have honest conversations and to cultivate a community that is clear on what the goals are, both short and long term, but where you have some awareness of what the things are that your team and the individuals on your team are trying to accomplish for themselves and their careers, I think helps you guide them in that way, and helps you evaluate sort of what they want and the actions that they're taking and how they relate to your business needs. Because I think that is I think sort of being able to have that balance of employees and have that space for, to have a culture that knows how to keep the people that you need to keep, but also that helps people kind of focus on the things they want, and sometimes has to exit people when they need to exit, is really important. I think that is also part of like the healthy forward growth motion that a company takes on.
Thank you. Sorry, I knocked
No worries.
a little bit.
All right, one last question from Jesse, and then we'll call it a night. Jesse, you want to come up?
Hi, yeah. I'm just curious, the dynamic around if there's someone that's being sort of favorited or nurtured in a company with the potential of moving up in the company, but it's not explicit to the other team members. Just curious, like that dynamic, either as a manager, how you manage expectations around that, and or as someone who's within the company, how you sort of deal with that unspoken favoritism without hurting your own ego in the process. It's a hard question to articulate, but it's something
the question is, how do you support employees that are on an upward trajectory without hurting the feelings of other people on the team? I think I'm missing one part.
Yeah, I think that's along the lines of it, because ultimately I find that sometimes in a company, especially when roles are being developed, for example, if there isn't a director of product yet, there's just the VP and then there's a flat product manager level. When there's not really there's sort of competition that's being created, even though one person is being vetted, they've been chosen, but it's not spoken. So it creates it's sort of a toxic dynamic. I don't know if you have any experience behind that, or how to deal with that, either as someone who is a higher up who's needing to just fill a new role so that they can deal with more high level issues in the company, or as someone.
I think that's when leadership just needs to be explicit about what they're trying to do. If they are trying to have a head of product, then they need to have a formal role opened and do a formal hiring process around that, as opposed to, who was pinch hitting the best while we didn't have a head of product. Now, mind you, open the role. If you do have favorites, let them interview. But I mean, I think they should take a agnostic look at the role, so then people know, hey, everyone had a fair shot. They got the role or they didn't. Mind you, the people that didn't get the role may say, the person before was the favorite as per the panel. I mean, there's no way to really check for that. So that's what I would say, but at least the toxicity of, at least there not being transparency is taken out of it, because you've had a formal interview process for the role. People had the opportunity to interview, and, hopefully the best person gets the role. I mean,
Right.
Some organizations are more strict and formal than others to make sure that bias and favoritism is totally stripped out of the process. But I know that other companies will say, oh, well, Sarah was already doing this job for 6 months, so Sarah should just have the job, and she's got the most relevant experience. Yeah, okay, well, that's not very, very equitable to the other folks. And also, I mean, I think we also have a rule at Google where even if we do have a role that's open, you have to post it externally, and leave the post up for a certain amount of time, because you want to make sure that external candidates have a fair shot at the role, to make sure you're actually getting the best talent.
I also think, I think if there is a favoritism issue happening, and even if it's isolated, I think, to me, this kind of goes back to like a culture of transparent conversations. And the second book I'll recommend is also by Ben Horowitz, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And I think having hard conversations and direct conversations, if you are observing that there is, I think if you're observing that something is kind of manifesting as favoritism, and that is having a detrimental or toxic effect on culture and people's relationships with each other, that is ultimately going to affect the work, and how efficient you are at producing results. And so I think that those are the types of conversations that are incredibly difficult, but it's important to hit them head on. I think like the transparency of the role and how we work, and the definition of it is critical, and showing how it fits in. But I also think, I think having a space where you can have a difficult conversation about the way something is showing up for the rest of the company is just really important to the foundation of the company. And it's totally scary. Easier said than done, but I think it's like a moment where you're sort of like, this is going to be hard, but I'm going to do it.
Totally. I would plus one that. I think that the idea of like having a sort of a toxic environment is it's a much more sort of systemic problem than just like one person feeling like they have they're being favorited. I think there's like probably a lot more. It goes back to, I think, both what Jason and you have said, Nithya, like around setting expectations, making everyone making sure that everyone knows what their job is, giving them a clear path of understanding kind of like what their own trajectories are, independent of like what happens with other folks and their trajectories as well. Hopefully that answers your question, Jesse.
It does. Thank you so much for helping to clarify what I'm asking. Cool.
All right. Well, I just wanted to thank Jason and Nithya for such a wonderful and enlightening conversation. I know I'm taking away a lot from this conversation and going to start applying it to my own interview process. But thank you all for attending. We'll be sharing the link for this panel very shortly. And and if you have any feedback or want to continue the conversation, we'll be over in our Slack community, and feel free to sort of ask any questions there. And I think, thanks again, everyone.